Hello, welcome to American Government. Today we're talking about Chapter 13, which deals with Congress. We're going to talk first of all about what the Constitution says about Congress, and then we'll talk a bit about congressional representatives. Who are they? Who are the people in Congress? And thirdly, we're going to be talking about how Congress works. How is it organized? What are its functions? And then how does Congress actually go about making laws? All right, so websites for you to check out here. There are a number of things. U.S. House of Representatives and Senate all have their own websites. You can look up your representatives, your senator. There's a thing called the Congressional Record, which is the transcript, basically, of congressional sessions. And it's been going since the beginnings of Congress in 1780s. And they've produced this every single day. It is a more or less verbatim record of the talks on the floor of the houses. It also includes information about bills that are being considered. It includes speeches that Congress people make, et cetera, et cetera. It is the official record of what the House and the Senate each do. It's a multi-volume kind of thing each year that is a massive collection. And a lot of big libraries or government depository libraries will have these kinds of things. Ballotpedia is another useful website if you're interested in looking into things like elections, who are candidates, what are they running on. Ballotpedia has information about the House and about Senate races, as well as state races. It has information about issues and referenda that are on ballots. If you are interested, remember that this Tuesday, November 2nd, is election day in the United States. And so if you're still not certain who your candidates are, you can go in and look up things on this and find out who are the various candidates in the races where you're registered to vote. All right. The Constitution of the US starts off with the articles that deal with the creation of the government. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch of the US government, and it's broken into two parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Article 2 deals with the presidency, which we'll talk about later on. Article 3 talks about the federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court. So Article 1, Section 1 talks about the establishment of the legislative branch, says that all legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress, which will consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. And Section 2 goes on to talk about the House of Representatives. It says basically that every member of the House of Representatives has a 2-year term. Every 2 years, everybody in the House is up for election or re-election. Requires a minimum age of 25 years. You have to have been a citizen of the United States for 7 years. So you don't have to have been born in the United States to be elected to the House of Representatives. Notice also that this is part of the compromise that led to the creation of the Constitution, which is how would representatives be chosen in the House of Representatives. What Madison and his supporters suggested was that the representatives in the House should be apportioned according to the population of the districts they represent, so that states that have bigger populations get more representatives in the House of Representatives, more seats in the House. This is determined by the census, U.S. Census, which is taken every 10 years, has been taken ever since 1790. Every 10 years, the census reveals the population changes in each state. And every 10 years, there's a reapportionment of the seats in the House of Representatives. Some states gain population, so they may gain a seat or two. Some states lose population, they may lose a seat or two. Over the years, what has happened is that the population of the United States has shifted from the Northeast, places like Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, out to the West and the South. Now places like California, Texas, Florida are the 3 largest populations, and so they have the 3 largest congressional delegations. The House chooses its own speaker, which is generally the person who is the head of the majority party in the House. And the Constitution also mentions that the House has the sole power of impeachment. Impeachment means indicting a federal official, president, vice president, federal judges, anybody who is an appointed federal person that is a cabinet member, et cetera. They can be impeached for high crimes, misdemeanors, misdemeanors. They can be impeached for taking bribes or treason. Article 1, Section 3 goes on to talk about senators. Senators, there are different. Representatives are apportioned by the population of their district and the districts they represent, but senators, each state got 2 senators. 13 states at the time of the Constitution, so 26 senators. And as the US has grown and more states have been added, now up to 50, we still have 2 senators per state. That is 100 senators in the Senate. These were originally not elected directly by the people. Only the members of the House were voted on directly by the people in elections every 2 years. For senators, every 6 years, it was up to the state to choose the senators. And it was usually the state legislature who chose the senators to represent the state for the next 2 years, which meant that the people had very little say in that. That is, that the legislature would choose people to be senators who generally were people connected to the legislature or the governor, people who were prominent in the state, those kind of things. So it wasn't a democratic system. The idea was that the Senate was there as a check upon the House of Representatives. The House could be voted in by the people, and the people may vote for bad people to represent them, or they may get swayed by the passions of the moment. And so the senators were supposed to be there to put check on the House and make sure that they didn't do things that were unreasonable or not in the national interest. The Constitution also says that senators have to be 30 years old, 5 years older than members of the House, and they have to have been a citizen for 9 years, not just 7 years as with representatives. The Vice President of the United States serves as the President of the Senate. That is, the Vice President has the job of presiding over Senate meetings. Generally, the Vice President doesn't actually do that. They appoint President pro tempore, which is a member of the Senate who basically has the role of managing the gavel and calling on speakers, those kind of things, in place of the Vice President. The Senate, according to the Constitution, has the sole power to try all impeachments. So any federal official who is impeached by the House has to be tried by the Senate. And the Senate has to convict by a 2/3 majority of the members present at the time of the trial. There have been 4 presidential impeachments over the years: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump twice. All 4 of these have been impeached by a majority vote in the House. All 4 of them survived the trial in the Senate, so the Senate did not convict any of these 4 presidents who were impeached. The Senate has convicted people who've been impeached, but almost all of those have been federal judges that were impeached for bribery. The Constitution says other kinds of things about Congress, including about their salaries, and then it spells out in Section 7, Article 1, Section 7 and 8, what are the powers of Congress. Congress has the power of the purse, as they say. That is, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, it says. That means that the president can't spend federal money without the approval of the House, but every bill that comes out of the House has to also be approved by the Senate. And so both houses of the legislative branch have to approve spending bills before the president can spend any money. This is what they call division of power, separation of powers. The other kinds of powers here are what are called the enumerated powers of Congress in Section 8. And that is a place where that spells out certain powers that are specific to Congress and specific to the federal government. That is, that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, has the power to borrow money, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states and with the Indian tribes, and has the power to constitute tribunals, that is, courts below the level of the Supreme Court, federal district courts, federal courts of appeals. Congress has the right to declare war, has the right to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for the correct working of the government. So these are enumerated powers that are restricted to Congress and to the federal level of government. And so the president cannot declare war. Only Congress can do that. The president, though, is named as the commander-in-chief of the military. And so the way it works out is the president can commit troops, but must seek congressional approval for the funding to support that war effort. Various kinds of things like that we'll talk about later on as well. A few other kinds of things that the expanded federal power. Section 9 puts a limit on importation of slaves until 1808. It also says that the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in case of rebellion or invasion when the public safety may require it. Talked about this earlier in section on civil liberties. Section 10 of the Constitution could be construed as outlawing secession. There's nothing specifically in the Constitution that says states can't leave the federal union. The Constitution talks about the process by which a territory can become one of the United States. That's spelled out, but it doesn't actually say whether a state could then leave the United States or not. The assumption was that no state would ever want to leave the United States. It was a one-way process. But 1861, states do try to leave the United States. Well, the section 10 of Article 1 says that no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation with another state or a foreign country. So states cannot make treaties with, say, British or something like that. Only the US government can do that. It also says that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. And so these could be construed as outlawing secession. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about here is our representatives. Okay, so every 2 years there's an election, and every 2 years all 435 members of Congress of the House come up for re-election. Now, the general practice is that once a person is elected as a representative, they become what's known as an incumbent. And so 2 years later, the chances of them getting re-elected are extremely high. It's very rare for an incumbent to be thrown out of the House of Representatives. They tend to stay as long as they want. Now, which means that you oftentimes get members of the House of Representatives who serve very long terms, 10 years, 20 years, 30, even 40 or 50 years. They can be in the House of Representatives because they're at a tremendous advantage when it comes to the re-election because they have already been in the office. And so lots of people just renew their representatives, but they also have access to being able to do things as a representative. So they have a record, which they can tout to their constituents. They also have access to party funds for re-election and various things like that. And so it's difficult, but people get elected to the House. And then what happens is sometimes members of the House will retire, they'll get sick, they'll die in office. They might decide to run for some other office like senator or president, or they might run for governor of their home state or various kinds of things like that. So there is exchange of people. Also, because you've got the census every 10 years, the seats are gained and lost. So some people will be in seats that will be eliminated because of the census, and then other states other seats will open up. Well, consider who's in Congress. First of all, in the House, about 73% of all members of the House, this is the current House of Representatives, 117th Congress, which is in session from January 21 to January 23. 73% are white, 89% of senators are white. In the US, the average is about 61% of the population is white. And so white people are heavily overrepresented in Congress. African Americans in the House make up about 13%, about 3% of the Senate. They're about 13% of the US population. So the rough equity in terms of the House, severely underrepresented in the Senate. Hispanic and Latinos make up about 18% of the population, but about 8% of the House and 6% of the Senate. So they're underrepresented. Asian, South Asian, and Pacific Americans are, again, slightly underrepresented in both the House and the Senate. Native Americans make up about 1% of the population. There's about 1% of the House. That would be 4 members of the House are Native Americans, and no members of the Senate are. In terms of gender, men heavily overrepresented in the House and the Senate, 73 and 76%, whereas men make up about 47% of the overall US population. Women are severely underrepresented in both houses of Congress. Age, members of the House and Senate tend to be older than the median age of the US. Median means that half of the US population is over 38, half of it's under 38. The House and Senate, it's way over that. Now, partly this is because people develop careers before they run for the House. Partly it's people like older candidates because they feel like they're better, more experienced, et cetera. Oftentimes people who are in the House and Senate have had a political career at the state or local level already before they run for office at the national level. In terms of education, members of the House and Senate are much more highly educated than the U.S. population overall. The U.S. population, about 27% actually have bachelor's degrees, whereas in the Senate, it's 100%, and the House is 94%. Interestingly, 6% of the House, that'd be about 6 people, do not have bachelor's degrees. Some of them have other kinds of degrees, or some of them don't have not gone to college. Most of them, how to put it, the people with law degrees, again, heavily overrepresented in Congress. No college at all makes up only about 0.5% of the people in the House. That would be 2 people. In the Senate, nobody currently has no college education. Senators and representatives also tend to be much more wealthy than the average American. Senators, the average net worth is 3.2 million, representatives around 900,000, but in the US, that net worth is about 79,000 as an average. For whites, net worth is about 171,000, African Americans, about 1/10 of that. Just net worth means basically what you own in terms of housing, stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, bank accounts, various kinds of things like that, minus what you owe, which would be credit card debt, loans, mortgages, various kinds of things like that. It is possible to have a negative net worth if you owe more money than everything you own combined. And this is oftentimes the case with younger people, oftentimes the case with minorities when they've not accrued wealth over generations. They don't inherit homes and houses, things like that, businesses from their families. How does this affect their voting? The book says that there are 3 theories of how people vote: representational, organizational, attitudinal. I would add a 4th one here, which is class, that the book doesn't talk about. The representational view, according to the book, is that they go as representatives. And so people in Congress will vote the way they think their constituents want them to vote on various issues. They will say, the people of the state of New York want this to happen, and so I represent them and vote that way. Theory, that's what we want them to do. We've elected them to office, and so we want our representatives to represent us. But there are other 2 alternatives to this, which is the organizational view, which is the idea that these are all part of an organization. Right? These people are part of a big party. They're part of a body of legislators that has to work together. They're on committees together. They live in the same city part of the year at least. And so the argument is that they will vote according to their party leaders or their colleagues. Right? The person sitting next to them in the House may have a view on something, and they say, how are you going to vote on this issue? They say, I'm going to vote yes. And the person says, okay, I guess I'll vote yes too, because I like this person, I trust them, I want to be good friends with them, I want to work with them on this other committee, kind of a thing. And so the organizational view is the idea that Congress people may not necessarily vote the way their constituents want them. They may vote because somebody there in the body of the legislature with them is voting a certain kind of way. 3rd view is the attitudinal view, which is to say that Congress people have their own views, their own attitudes about things, and they will vote according to that. If you look at the vote on the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, now this was a couple of years ago, this was a vote in which you had a Republican majority in the Senate, very, very slim Republican majority in the Senate, and the vote was 50-48 with 2 abstentions. Now, basically, the way this worked was 50 Republicans voted for Kavanaugh, 48 Democrats voted against Kavanaugh, and 2 just decided to abstain. Well, those 2 would have been Democrats or Democratic-leaning people. So the 3 views are represented in these votes. Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, who was a Democrat, voted for Brett Kavanaugh. And he said he was voting in favor of the confirmation because the people of West Virginia wanted him to be confirmed. People of West Virginia tend to be heavily Republican. Manchin is a former governor of West Virginia. He's a Democrat, very conservative Democrat, who tends to vote more with Republicans than he does Democrats, as we've seen lately. Organizational view, look at the breakdown between the parties. The Republicans all voted for, Democrats all voted against, except for those 2 abstentions. And so it was clear from the proceedings leading up to the vote that the party leaders expected their parties to maintain solidarity and vote their way. 3rd view, the attitudinal view, was expressed by a representative from North Dakota. This would have been Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who's from North Dakota. She's a Democrat. But North Dakota, again, is a largely Republican state. Heidi Heitkamp heard all of the arguments about this. She heard all the evidence about Brett Kavanaugh's sexual harassment complaints. And she said that she could not, in all good conscience, vote for his confirmation. She said she thought he was inappropriate and the wrong choice for the Supreme Court, that he should not be on the Supreme Court, and she was going to vote against him because of him, regardless of what her constituents thought or wanted her to vote. She said it was the right thing. My constituents may not agree with me and I may lose the next election, but I will not vote to confirm Kavanaugh. And sure enough, she voted against Kavanaugh, and then she lost her next election bid, re-election bid. So these are the three kinds of theories about voting. A fourth one, as I mentioned before, I think has to do with class. Now, one thing about people in Congress is they're wealthy people. They have, for the most part, not lived in poverty, with one notable exception, which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a bartender before she became a congressperson. But most Congress people come from wealthy backgrounds. They come from well-off families. They tend to have high education. They tend to have high net worth. And that leads them to vote about issues in certain kinds of ways. And if you go back and look at how Congress voted on bills during the pandemic, about relief, about aid to people who are unemployed, various kinds of things like that, you'll see the way they went about doing this and the amounts of money that they voted to approve for relief payments during that pandemic were based on their assumption that life is not, that their constituents didn't need this money to get by. That $300 a week was plenty of money for a person to live on. None of them has ever lived on $300 a week. They wouldn't have a clue what it's like to live on that kind of money every week. So they vote for things according to their own perceptions of the society, which are skewed because of their own class backgrounds. Okay. Leadership in Congress. Now, the Senate, as I mentioned before, you have a president who is the vice president, and then there's the president pro tempore, which is the person who represents the vice president when the vice president is not available, which is most of the time. And then you have a majority leader and a minority leader in each of the parties, of each of the parties. And this is the breakdown, basically, these 100 states. Right now, you've got 50 Republicans, you got 48 Democrats, and you got 2 independents who vote with the Democrats. So basically, it's a 50-50 split. Now, Kamala Harris, as the president, is the role under the Constitution of casting the deciding vote if they are split. Congress, the way it works, has a rule that they adopted many years ago that says that basically 60% of senators have to vote in order to pass anything. Now, the problem is that the Senate rarely has 60 seats controlled by one of the parties. For a long time, they've been very evenly split in the Senate, with the result that the Senate has a really difficult time getting anything done by anybody, for the Republicans or the Democrats. They just end up squabbling a lot of time, and this has led to a lot of discontent among Americans with what they call deadlock in Congress. House of Representatives has a speaker who is generally the longest serving member of the majority party. In this case, Nancy Pelosi, who is now in her 80s. And then there's a majority leader, a minority leader. The minority leader, if the Republicans retake the Congress in 2022, Kevin McCarthy, the current minority leader, will become the Speaker of the House, and Nancy Pelosi would become presumably the minority leader. The House is also very evenly split. Right now, there are 219 Democrats, 212 Republicans, and there are 4 vacant seats in the House of Representatives. Those could go either way. If they were to go Republican, that would mean it'd be 219 to 216. That means that for the Democrats to get anything through, they have to have absolute solidarity among the party to get anything, get like a majority of getting anything done by the House. The party solidarity in the House is stronger than it is in Congress. In Congress right now, you've got Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, who are both Democratic senators, but are very conservative, and they tend not to vote on various things that the Democrats want. And so they've held up a lot of legislation over the last couple of years, including Biden's economic recovery agenda, which he's been pushing for, which has been whittled away and whittled away. That was already passed by the House because the Democrats had a solid enough majority to get the bill through. Okay. look at a few things here. This is related to the 2020 election, and talk about the results and how that affects things in the way Congress operates here. So in the 2020 election, Joe Biden won. They won about 5 million more votes than Donald Trump did. And yes, those are real votes. They've been counted and certified, which meant that Biden won about a little bit less than 52% of the vote versus Trump's 48% of the vote. Well, because the electoral votes for president operate under states, that means that they're skewed so that a person who wins 52% of the popular vote doesn't necessarily get 52% of the electoral votes. They actually get much more because, for instance, Biden won California, which has almost 50 electoral votes. So he wins all of them. It's not spread out, even though the popular vote in California was not 100% for Biden. All the electoral votes did go to him. Same with Trump. They win all of the electoral votes in most of the states, only 2 that split them, and they're not enough to make a difference. In the House, in the 2020 election, the Democrats actually lost seats, so that while Biden won the election as president as a Democrat, the Democrats didn't do so well in Congress. They lost seats in the House, meaning that their majority considerably narrowed. In the Senate, there were 34 seats that were up for election. Democrats won 15 of them, Republicans won 19. So the Republicans actually picked up seats in the Senate as well. So as a result, you end up with this very narrow margin of majority for the Democrats in the House, and almost no majority in the Senate. Okay. So how does Congress work? The book talks about the various kinds of aspects of Congress here, including committees and legislation, various kinds of things like that. Okay, so committees tend to be hierarchical kinds of things. Junior or newly elected people in Congress tend to get appointed to committees, and every congressperson gets appointed to a certain number of committees, usually 2 or 3, something like that. And there are committees, some that are considered the big ones, like budget, foreign affairs, Justice Committee, things like that, can be big ones. And then there are smaller ones that deal with more local kinds of stuff or minor kinds of things. And so everybody generally has a minor and a major committee that they're appointed to. These are made by the leadership of the party and the houses there. There are 3 kinds of committees. Standing committees, which are permanent ones. They meet all the time. They have specific responsibilities. Ways and Means is the committee that deals with how the government finds its money, taxes, spending, those kind of things. The Judicial Committee in the Senate is the one that deals with nominations to federal appointments and the Supreme Court and those kind of things. Then there are select committees, which are committees that are temporary. They have a specific purpose. They're there to investigate something, like the Select Committee on the January 6th insurrection. It's not a standing committee. The idea is that committee will do its work and then be disbanded. And then there are joint committees or conference committees, which are committees that work across the 2 houses. So you have members of the House and members of the Senate on joint committees. And these are ones that generally deal with the financial kinds of things, spending bills that are going to have to be worked out. So if the House wants to spend this much on something and the Senate says no, then they get a joint committee that works out the differences and comes up with a new bill. The Congress actually, what it does is it considers legislation. And these are 2 main types of legislation: bills and resolutions. Resolutions are something that Congress can pass all by itself. They don't actually need presidential approval, because a resolution is basically a statement of the wishes or the will of Congress, that wants its opinions on things. So a resolution can be something like the Congress can pass a resolution to honor the work of healthcare providers during the pandemic. And their resolution is to say that these people are heroes and they did a great job for the United States, kind of a thing. So that's a resolution. Generally, resolutions tend to be that kind of thing, and more ceremonial than anything. But they can be some more serious kind of things. Basically, the resolution could be something like saying Congress thinks the president should do this, should support this, should spend money on this, kind of a thing. Bills are things that have to be drawn up. They're formal proposals that have to be voted on by both houses of Congress, and they have to be worked out in committees. They have to be read a number of times, and there's actually a formal vote of some sort that has to be taken before they're passed. So with legislation, basically what you get all the time is it's introduced to Congress. Generally, it's introduced by a sponsor or co-sponsors. So depending on the kind of bill, you might have one person who sponsors a bill, let's say to set aside some federal land in Wyoming for a camp for children. That person gets up, they introduce their bill. And then the speaker or the president of the House takes the Senate, takes the bill, and they pass it on to the appropriate committee. Committees then hand them out to subcommittees. And so they might hand it out to a committee on federal lands, a committee on construction, a committee on children, whatever kinds of things. And then subcommittees go into the specific details, what particular land will be used, who will actually do the construction work, where will the money come for this, will there be fees charged for it, will it be free, how will children get to the camp, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so all these subcommittees work out all these kind of things. They then come back to the full committee. The committee then puts together the bill, then they send it to the Rules Committee, which decides on how this will proceed. Will it be voted on by the full House? Will it be done as a resolution? Will it be a spending bill? Will it be whatever kind of things? And then it's sent back to the Speaker or the President, and they then decide whether it comes to the House floor or the Senate floor. Now, at any of these levels, the bill can just be killed. So a person can stand up and say, I introduced this bill. The Speaker or the President can just say, thank you for your time, sit down, and everything. Or the subcommittees can decide that, no, this isn't going to work. And so they can recommend against it. And the full committee can just say, no, not going to happen. Most legislation that's proposed never gets out of committees. It gets changed. It gets just denied. It gets added to something else, or it gets postponed, or whatever kinds of things happen like that. And so most legislation actually doesn't actually make it back to the House, to the floor to be debated. Big things like the annual budget, like stimulus packages, defense spending bills, oftentimes those go back and they're debated on in the House or the Senate. If it's in the House, then the House votes. If it passes, they then send it to the Senate. Once the Senate has approved of a bill, and if it requires spending, then both of them have to approve it. The Senate, the House work out their differences in conference committees or joint committees, and then they send it to the president to sign, to veto, or do a pocket veto. Okay, what the president can do is simply sign the bill. And oftentimes what happens is presidents will sign something into law, and they will also do what's called a signing statement, which is their sort of declaration of how they see this bill being enforced. Because remember that Congress passes legislation, but the executive branch actually enforces legislation, actually makes it operational. And so the president can sign it and then say, I like this bill, I will do this kind of a thing. And oftentimes presidents will do a signing statement that fundamentally disagrees with what Congress seems to think is the purpose of the bill. Presidents can also veto the bill. They can say they will not sign it, in which case they have to send back a statement to Congress saying, this is why I'm vetoing this bill. It's too much money, not enough money, it's inappropriate, it's unconstitutional, whatever kinds of things like that. They can send it back. Congress then has the power to override the veto, but both houses, the 2/3 majority of both houses have to vote to override the veto, in which case then it goes into law over the president's veto. This has happened in times in American history. It's not very common, but it does happen. The third thing is a pocket veto. That is, the president has 2 weeks to sign legislation. If the president doesn't sign or veto something in 2 weeks, then it goes into effect anyway. So there's an option for the president, is just to ignore the piece of legislation that he knows is going to go into force. If he ignores it, they can do that. And that way it's a kind of, it doesn't have his signature on it. So he can say later on he disapproved of it, even though it went into effect kind of thing. The pocket veto is if the Congress is less than 2 weeks away from its adjournment, then the president can just sit on it and the Congress will run out. And any bills that have not been passed or have not been signed into law by the president at the end of each session just disappear. So Congress has to restart everything every 2 years. Everything was brand new. So there's nothing that holds over from last year unless they reintroduce it as another bill in a new session. That can happen. Okay, the book, go online. I said the book doesn't have this, but go online, you can see these kind of things, which is a map of how laws are made by the US. It starts over here with your bill, kind of goes through the House, and then goes over here to the Senate, where you get the debating, you get the calendar things, you get the committee work, and you get the same kinds of things over here in the Senate. You get the conference committees here in the middle, and then eventually comes over here to the president's signature, veto, et cetera. And there are various kinds of things that happen in here, including filibusters, reconciliation, all those kinds of things. All right, so impeachment has been in the news the last few years, and that's becoming old news, I suppose, now, but just wanted to say something about how impeachment works, because it's not a very common kind of thing. The House has initiated impeachment proceedings 64 times since 1784. Oh, that is how much? About once every 3 or 4 years, roughly, about every 4 years or so, it's impeached somebody. 19 federal officials have actually been impeached. So most of these 64 impeachment proceedings did not lead to actual impeachment. There was an investigation. The committee recommended against impeachment, or did, but the House voted against it. It didn't get its majority. Of those 19 federal officials, three of them have been presidents, 1 a cabinet secretary, 1 a senator, and 15 federal judges. 8 were convicted by the Senate. So out of those 64 people who have been impeached, only 8, 1/8 of them were actually convicted. All of those were judges, and I believe they're all impeached or convicted of bribery. That is, they were in position to make decisions in cases that they might have stock in a company. They decided in favor of the company, knowing that their stock was going to increase, something like that. Sometimes they're taking bribes. Senators did not convict Johnson on abuse of power, did not convict Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice, and not convict Trump for abuse of power. Nixon, Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, who was reelected in 1972, was investigated for his role in the break-in at the Watergate complex, where the Democratic National Committee had its headquarters. He was investigated for his role in a cover-up of the burglary. And it became clear by about 1974 that the House was going to vote on impeachment, and they would impeach Nixon. And it was pretty clear among senators, too, that if the House impeached Nixon, they would probably convict him, too. And that would have been the first time a president had actually been removed by the powers of the Congress under the Constitution. Nixon resigned instead. So in the summer of 1964, facing almost certain impeachment and conviction, he resigned. He's the only president who's ever resigned from his office. Okay, here's another thing that shows you the map of how the impeachment process operates. Okay, bills and resolutions. There are various kinds of things. Resolutions, there are the simple, the concurrent, the joint ones. The resolutions, simple resolutions, basically, Congress passes a law saying that we support the work of first responders during the pandemic. Concurrent is when both houses do it at the same time. The joint one is when both houses get together and come up with the same resolution. Various kinds of committees that deal with things like Ways and Means, which deal with taxes and spending, Rules Committee, which comes up with all the rules about how bills are considered. And then there are other kinds of things that are part of the process. So committees can also do things like restrict bills. They can accept a bill and they can say, okay, we will accept only 1 amendment to this bill, or we won't accept amendments to this bill. We're going to consider it as it is. They can also close discussion on bills. That is, the bill that comes to a committee can come with the obligation that they do this within the next week, or else kind of a thing. Or they can do an open consideration where all kinds of stuff can happen. There can be amendments allowed. And this is a common kind of a thing. Oftentimes, if it's an open bill, Congress people will add stuff onto it. They're called riders, which is usually spending for their own district. And so a congressperson might say, I will support this bill if you give me money for a children's camp in my district. And I want $10 million for that in order for me to vote on your resolution declaring people heroes during the pandemic, kind of a thing. Debate generally is open, but you have to be recognized. They follow parliamentary rules, which means the speaker or the president of the body has to call on a person, and that person in theory has the floor as long as they keep talking, or unless they're limited, so that sometimes the Speaker of the House will say, I recognize so-and-so for 2 minutes, kind of a thing. That's a quite common kind of thing. In the Senate, there's a thing called the closure rule, which is that you have to have a vote of 60 out of 100 senators to end a filibuster. A filibuster is when a person gets up and talks usually in opposition to something in order to prevent a vote happening on it, and just keep talking and talking and talking. So they're recognized by the president of the Senate, and a filibuster is when they don't stop talking. And so the vice president, the president of the Senate can't actually call on somebody else to talk. As long as that person keeps talking, then you can't proceed with the vote on the bill. Well, if you need 60 votes to end a filibuster in the Senate, then how's that ever going to happen in this Senate when you've got a 50 split? Getting to a 60-40 is going to be very difficult, and that's the idea, I suppose, is in the Senate. The purpose was to make it difficult to pass legislation, and that way you don't go into any kind of crazy schemes just on the whim of the moment kind of a thing. Voting, it comes in these different kinds of ways. One is a voice vote where they just say all in favor say aye, and then people in favor say aye, and the speaker or the president declare that the bill passed or didn't according to the volume. A division or standing vote is when people actually have to raise their hands or stand up to be counted. And so there's an actual count. The voice vote, they don't count. They just declare that this is the majority. A division vote forces people to go on record as having voted, and these division or standing votes are recorded in the congressional record as saying, that this many people voted for the bill, this many people voted against it. A roll call vote is when people have to sign their name to it. And so this way you know the individual. So you can actually look up and see how your representative or your senator has voted on particular bills. And you look at the roll call votes. And roll call votes are used generally when people want to either to show who voted for and against something. I don't want to shame somebody for voting for or against it. They'll call for a roll call vote. And that requires everybody to come down and sign their name on a piece of paper, and the secretary in the House or the Senate then publishes this in the congressional record. Okay, that's all I've got for you today. So happy reading. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you again another time. Take care.